I've been in the legal recruiting business and placement business for over 20 years now, and the majority of placements of people that I make are not of people that went to the very best law schools. Getting into a good law firm will often require you to distinguish yourself in some way. So when you're in law school and you're applying to law firms have a choice of a lot of different people that they can hire. And they want to hire the people that look the smartest, the most dedicated, and that work the hardest. So if you go to a good law school, what that's saying is it's saying that you did very well in college, probably a good college, that you also got good scores on the LSAT, and that you show a history of being the sort of person that's very, very motivated and doing well. So law firms want to take your motivation and your ability to be smart and apply ideas and good test scores and so forth, and they want to give those to their clients. So the quality of the law school you went to shows your long-term commitment to doing well. I know attorneys, and even in my own family, that have, say, gotten a free ride to a law school that might be ranked number 25 or 30, and then have to pay to go to a law school that maybe is number 5 in the country. And they come to me with a question of, should I go to a law school that's ranked number 5 and come out hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, or should I go to a lesser ranked law school and go there for free? And my answer is always, you should spend the money. The law school you go to will open doors to good law firms. Your ranking is not going to matter as much when you come out. But conversely, if you do very, very well at a law school that's not as highly ranked, then you can still get into a major law firm. But it's much harder if you don't do very well. When you get out of school, and you've been out of school for a couple of years, if you're able to specialize in a certain practice area and do very well in that practice area, meaning maybe corporate law or some type of litigation, and you do very well, then you can always move to a better firm. You can always stay at your current firm and do well. And law firms, when they're hiring people, and I'm assuming that most people watching this are trying to get into the best law firms, they're looking for people that are specialists in different practice areas. So one example is it's very common for IP attorneys not to go to great law schools, or patent attorneys, because they're majoring in science, and science tends to have very hard curves, and it's harder to get good grades. And so when they go to a law school, it's not the best law school, and they come out and they work in smaller law firms. But because they're specialized over time, there's very few attorneys that are as specialized as they are. They tend to almost always move to bigger firms, more than half the time, I would say. So it doesn't necessarily matter where you went to law school. Your practice area is very important. Showing how stable you are once you get into a law firm is very important. Having a lot of interest in your practice area and writing articles and so forth and really throwing yourself into it is important, because when you come out of law school, really what's happening is the law firms have a lot of choices of who to hire. So imagine they've got 30,000 people that are coming out of law school each year, and they only have 10 spots or 15 spots. They can hire people from the best law schools with the best grades. But after a few years, what happens is there's very few people in different practice areas, because everyone's kind of going different ways. People are choosing not to stay with the practice of law and doing other things. And so you become more marketable actually as time goes by. And the more commitment you show in your practice area and your niche and so forth, the better off you're going to be. So that's helpful. Another thing is, even if you're not coming out of a top law school, it's going to matter how you look and how you dress, how professional you are, how motivated you seem, how well you did in that law school, how you look in terms of someone on paper that's going to do well. So I see attorneys all the time that come out of law schools and aren't top law schools, but they just have this kind of energy about them and things that people pick up when they talk to them that makes them look very attractive and they get hired. So that's important. As you get more senior, the more business you have and so forth can also be important. Your law school is most important when you're coming out of law school and when you're trying to get a job as a summer associate or something like that in a law firm, because the law firms have no basis of comparison other than the quality of law school you're going to. So that's important. The other reason that law school matters is that it's important for law firms to look good to their clients. So having a graduate from Harvard Law School on their letterhead and so forth, and when people look up their attorneys, is going to be much more important to them than having someone from a lower ranked law school. If the person's from a much lower ranked law school, say for example, University of Kentucky, then if it's a major national law firm in a major geographic area, they're going to want that person to have very good qualifications and look like have been at the very top of their class and so forth. And they're going to want to have more people from Harvard than the University of Kentucky so they can look strong. But really the most important time is when you're coming out of law school, because the law firms have no other basis to compare you to the thousands of people that could potentially work in their law firm. The LSAT's important because what happens when attorneys get inside of a law firm and when they start getting in the legal world is they're presented with all these problems. And the best attorneys that I've ever hired and have ever worked for me might not necessarily be suited to practicing law in the long term, but they can look at problems and come up with very elegant solutions using the law, and they can a lot of times do so very, very quickly. I can think of 2 attorneys that have worked for me in the recent past, and one of them graduated number 2 or 3 in his class from a top law school. The law school had this thing that they gave this prize to attorneys that ranked in the top 3 in their class, and they didn't tell them if they were 1, 2, or 3. They just kind of gave them this award when they graduated. This attorney had that, and he worked for me. And another attorney I can think of graduated from law school, a top 5 law school, and he was 19 years old. And because he was so young, he couldn't get a job, and I ended up hiring him. But with both of these attorneys, what would happen is they would look at very complex legal problems, and they would instantly, like very quickly, come up with solutions that worked in my favor, but that a normal attorney might spend hours writing memos and thinking about and so forth. So very smart attorneys can figure out problems very quickly, can come up with solutions, and the LSAT actually does test that. So the LSAT's an important test because it really shows the ability of people to read quickly, understand ideas, understand false arguments, and then take puzzles and so forth and come up with solutions. I used to think the LSAT was just a bunch of gibberish, but when I came up and started seeing attorneys that did incredibly well, like 175, 178 and so forth on the test, I really gained a lot of respect for it. Now, one thing I would say is that over time, it may test your ability at one point in time, but if an attorney gets into a good law firm and they start practicing around other very smart attorneys, they're going to develop the same skills, and they can learn all this stuff, and they can learn it through osmosis, and they become very good. But when an attorney is getting ready to go to law school, these abilities and stuff are almost natural, and they pick them up. A lot of attorneys are into Dungeons and Dragons and things like that when they're young, because I think that a lot of the logical arguments and so forth are taught there. They might like science fiction and that sort of thing. Anybody can become a good lawyer. The biggest thing is you could go to Harvard Law School if you go to even not a very good college. Harvard Law School takes people from every state, but you have to do very well in that school. I had an attorney once working here as a recruiter that majored in fashion, some college in Florida, and ended up going to a major law school, I believe it was Northwestern, and doing very well there. But she also did extremely well on her LSAT. So if you don't go to a really good college, it doesn't really matter. It's going to come down to your LSAT scores. I see attorneys all the time that go to very good law schools that have started off in 2-year colleges in California. So there's all these 2-year colleges, and if you do very well in them, which a lot of them do, I mean, if you get like a 3.9 and stuff, you can transfer to Berkeley, because Berkeley is a state school. You can transfer to UCLA after a couple years of college, and then from UCLA or Berkeley, you can very easily, if you do very well there and your grade point stays high, you can go to a good law school. So law schools care about where you went to school. I mean, Yale Law School, for example, is going to take a lot of people from other Ivy League schools that did very well. They tend to major in classics. I mean, when someone goes to Yale Law School, it's a little different than most law schools because they're looking at the quality of the classes they've taken, and they have so many applicants they can afford to really look at people that are very interesting and are probably going to take ideas and things far. But most law schools, for the most part, most very good national law schools, which would be like Michigan, UCLA, Virginia, are going to be looking for people that did very, very well in college, but they're not as concerned about where they went to college as kind of how their numbers match up. So law schools are interested in people that They want the highest grade point average and the highest LSATs possible because law schools are ranked by U.S. News and World Report based on that information. To get the best legal jobs when you're coming out of law school, there's lots of fields you can go into if you didn't go to the best law school. So a lot of times there's moves you can make to get into the best law firm, even if you didn't do that well in law school or go to a very good law school. Now, one way you can do that is getting clerkships. The best clerkships are going to be with federal district judges and then federal appellate judges. If you go in and you apply to enough federal clerkship jobs, I mean in your state and where you're from, but all over the country, and you go and work for a judge and you excel and you work as hard as you can and you're dedicated and really you learn, you do the best you can, you could even get potentially an appellate clerkship. Getting a job with a federal district judge is a very good thing, and it can help you transition into all sorts of different types of law firms. But getting a job with a federal appellate judge can, in most cases, get you into some of the top law firms in the country. I saw once an attorney graduate with a C+ average from University of Minnesota Law School, which C+ average isn't great. I mean, it's probably in the bottom 25% of her class. She ended up getting a federal district clerkship and did very well there and was able to apply and get a federal appellate clerkship after that and ended up with one of the top litigation firms in the country. I couldn't believe it. So this kind of thing happens all the time. So getting a clerkship's a good idea. If you're a patent attorney and you can't get a job with a patent law firm or you can't get a job with a big firm, it's much easier to get a job with a patent and trademark office. You can do that for a few years. I've placed lots of attorneys from the patent and trademark office into major firms. Another thing you can do locally a lot of times is you can work for a local prosecutor's office. Sometimes you can get a job in the U.S. Attorney's Office, very rarely, and then when you work in a local prosecutor's office, you can transfer into the U.S. Attorney's Office. Once you're in the U.S. Attorney's Office, a lot of times you can get jobs in major law firms. So those are some of the best ways of doing it. Other ideas, if you didn't go to the best law school, would be to work in a law firm in a very focused niche that not a lot of people do. Focused niches would be like healthcare law. There's just lots of niches. Healthcare law, patent prosecution is another one, but I mentioned that earlier. Certain ERISA, people from ERISA law firms a lot of times can transition into major law firms. Different types of tax. On BCG, you can kind of look at all the practice areas, but anything that's a niche practice area a lot of times can help you transition into a major firm. Corporate is another one, most types of corporate law. And so that's the best way of doing it. Law firms want to hire people that did the best in law school because it shows how you're competing and doing against other people in the competitive environment. It also has a lot to do with how intelligent you look, how motivated you were. And if you did well in law school, within reason, it doesn't really matter where you went to law school if you're at the very, very top of your class or the top of your class. One thing I would say about law school performance is for litigators, it tends to be very important. Litigation is about reading and analyzing ideas and so forth and skills. And for whatever reason, to work in a top litigation firm, it's very important to have very good grades a lot of times, because a lot of what you're taught in law school revolves around litigation type skills, so the reading and writing and taking exams. Law firms are typically not as interested in people that are trying to switch practice areas. They're less interested, especially larger firms and generalists. So if you try to switch practice areas a lot of times, law firms will be a little bit hesitant to hire you because they'll think that you may not be committed to the practice of law. People come out of top law schools all the time and go into practice areas where they may not necessarily be interested, but they commit. And if you do something long enough, you'll generally find reasons to like that practice area. Litigators, in order to stay busy, need to get business. And what tends to happen is litigators can't go in-house as easily as corporate attorneys, for example. So because a litigator can't go in-house as easily, it becomes much more difficult for them when they get more senior to get other types of jobs. If a litigator becomes senior, it's very difficult for them to stay employed. And so when they lose their jobs, a lot of times there's not a lot of firms that are interested in hiring senior litigators without business. In contrast, they are a lot of times interested in hiring corporate attorneys or real estate attorneys or other types of people that can very easily go in-house. So if a litigator without a lot of business becomes senior, a lot of times it's very difficult for them. Litigation is a very difficult practice area. And you also need to have a lot of energy. I mean, you need to be able to argue in court, you need to be constantly writing and fighting, and can be very draining. So if you can't get business as a litigator when you're in your first 4 or 5 years, it's going to be very difficult for you. I've seen lots of litigators fail. I've seen litigators make partner in major law firms and not be able to bring in business and lose their jobs. It's a tough practice area. Anything related to patent law is very good. It's a good reason to go to law school. Most law attorneys that go to law school major in things like English, political science, anthropology. And a lot of times the reason that they go to the best law schools is it tends to be a little bit easier to get good grades in those practice areas. In those subjects, and there's a lot of other practice areas. I remember taking anthropology classes in college, and I thought I was on drugs. I was reading about different cultures, running around naked in the desert and stuff. It was fun, but it's not something that necessarily taxes your mind very much. Whereas very difficult majors like physics or computer science, electrical engineering, chemistry, and so forth really tend to require a lot of thought, and not as many people do those. And the other thing is when people come out of school and major in things like patent law or major in sciences, they also have the ability to go and work in companies and private businesses and make a lot of money right out of school. Whereas an anthropologist who's been reading about people running around naked may not necessarily have that ability. So patent attorneys are therefore quite rare, and law firms always need them, and patent attorneys can generally almost always get jobs. ERISA and executive compensation is a good practice area just because there's not a lot of attorneys that do it. Even senior attorneys with a lot of business can get jobs in the practice area. Another thing that's really good about ERISA and executive compensation is that if an attorney has really good experience in this, they don't necessarily care where the person went to school just because there's not a lot of them. I would say there's fewer ERISA and executive compensation attorneys than there are patent attorneys. Another thing is that you can often transition into partnership roles if you're majoring in risk and executive compensation, because a lot of the clients of the firms tend to be institutional, so they're constantly just feeding their risk and executive compensation work, and the law firms just kind of need to plug in senior attorneys a lot of times. I've placed lots of senior risk and executive compensation attorneys. When the market's very active, corporate attorneys can get lots of jobs. I've seen people come out of 3 or 4 person law firms and go to like major 500 person law firms with experience in corporate law. So corporate's a very good practice area, especially if you didn't go to a great law school and you get experience in corporate, you can transition a lot of times into larger firms. The only danger with corporate is when there's a recession and so forth, the market can dry up very quickly. Real estate is a great practice area as well. There's always opportunities for real estate attorneys, whether it's leasing or sales or working on REITs. The market's always good for real estate attorneys for the most part. The only time I've ever seen the market slow for real estate attorneys was in, I think, maybe 2000 when interest rates were high. They were 7%, I think, back then. So there were fewer deals. But since then, the market's been very, very good for real estate attorneys. Real estate attorneys can go in-house. There's very few of them. They can get experience in industries like hospitality, for example, and go to law firms. There's all sorts of things real estate attorneys can do. Trust and estates is also a good practice area. There are more trust and estates attorneys than there are real estate attorneys, but at the same time, it's very specialized. There's lots of boutiques that do trust and estates. The only drawback of trust and estates is a lot of times you're doing small amounts of work at one time for individual clients, so the fees may not be as high, but it's still a great practice area. A law firm wants to hire people that look stable. So anytime an attorney is like moving every 1 or 2 years, and they do that 3 times or so, the law firm's going to figure they're going to move again. The reason the attorney moved, there may be very good reasons, but in most cases the law firms will assume it had something to do with the quality of the attorney's work, or the attorney was asked to leave, or maybe the attorney's just not cut out for practicing law and is continually looking for green pastures when they just don't like practicing law. So the other thing is some people will go into an organization and do very well regardless of what happens. They'll be happy and productive. They'll do well, they'll have a good experience, while others will come into law firms and always not be happy and productive. Anytime I've hired someone that's had something on their experience, like I remember one of the first recruiters I hired had been at her last firm for 20 years. And incredibly, she stayed at this recruiting firm for 18 years before she retired. And other people I've hired were at their last job for 7 years, and they ended up staying 7 years. So a lot of times people, their past will repeat themselves, and things come at people in different types of employment situations, and some people will buckle down and stay there and learn and remember that everything's going to be the same, and other people will always find problems and leave. It's like that with relationships too. I remember talking to this guy that was in his 70s and he'd been married 5 times, and then he went back and married his first wife again. The idea was, he said that everybody's really the same. People keep finding fault with everything and you go right back to where you started. A book of business is sort of the whole point of having a law firm or being an attorney. And the reason is because when you get a law license, that's basically a license to charge people for legal services. And so when you get out of law school, a law firm that's hiring you will typically be training you when you start initially. But if you've been out of law school several years, you need to start building a book of business, because the idea is that you build a book of business, and that book of business allows you to have the firm service you and the clients as opposed to you getting just money from the firm. And the book of business allows you to have employment stability because you're not a cost center, you're a profit center for the firm. If you work hard and have a good reputation, then other attorneys will refer business to you. If they know you're willing to work hard, the better your reputation in the legal community, the more you're willing to get work referred to you. You'll get hired by other firms, and you'll just have a better experience practicing law in general. Looks and personality matter a great deal. Several years ago, I called UCLA because I was looking for a young junior attorney to work in our office. And there was one attorney that was like third in his class or something, and he came by. And when I shook his hand, there was like nothing there. It was like all cold and clammy. And I asked him questions, and he couldn't give me good answers. And he was hors de the coif and one of the top graduates of the school. But he had been unemployed for 6 months after graduating from law school. And the problem was he wasn't able to connect with me. People that are young, I mean, there's all sorts of things that are unfortunate in the law firm world, but younger people are more likely to hire than older people because law firms want the energy and the young vibrancy. Being tall is better than being short. Being social is better than being very socially withdrawn. And very attractive people are more likely, a lot of times, to get hired than people that aren't as attractive. People that are in very good physical shape are a lot more likely to get hired than people that aren't. It's just the way it works. So your idea is you're the whole person, and anybody that's an attorney is a product. So part of being a product means your schools and how well you did, and the firms you've worked in, and the practice area, and how you look, and how you connect with people. So all that stuff is important. You really need to work on yourself on every different level. I don't know you would call it discrimination. Some people might, and I guess maybe that's a good word for it. But law firms, you can imagine, are tribes. And so because they're tribes, they tend to hire people that are like them. So law firms that are composed of Catholic men are more likely to hire a Catholic man than they might be like an Orthodox Jewish man. It's just the way it works. There's law firms that are comprised of all African Americans, so it's probably going to be easier to get in there if you're an African American than not. The same thing, there's law firms that are comprised of all white people, and it's harder to get in a lot of times if you're not. I mean, I'm not condoning any of this, but you need to find people a lot of times that will share your interests when you get hired, especially if you're working in a small town. There's towns that are in the South where it's extremely conservative. I know one woman that got hired to work in a law firm in someplace in South Carolina, and no one would really socialize with her outside of work because she was an unmarried woman, and a lot of the people in the firm had known each other since high school, and they were all very conservative, and she wasn't. So it's just kind of a weird match. So you want to be associated with people that are like you, and to the extent you can, because the people that are like each other will help each other.